introduction.
That's
So
great,
welcome
Jack.
everyone. My name is Jack. I serve as the land management coordinator at the Vermont Land Trust, and I'm really excited to help present or help co-host this Birders Dozen webinar. Our two presenters tonight will be Steve Hagenbu, and if I mispronounce your name, Steve, please let me know.
You got it, nailed it.
Excellent. Steve is the Forest Conservation Program Manager with Audubon Vermont. He is based out of Waterbury. And then our other presenter is Caitlin Cusack. She is a forester with Vermont Land Trust, and she lives up in Bristol, Vermont. And they're both avid sugar makers who are proud of their bird-friendly producers products. And that is a program that Steve will talk more about. And then some quick Zoom housekeeping. By now, most people are probably familiar with Zoom, but this might be reviewed. So then look at the bottom of your screen in the Zoom window, and you can see a number of features that we'll be using tonight. The chat is just if you want to add commentary or if you need help troubleshooting something. If you look on that same toolbar, you can also see the Q&A button, and that's to ask a question to our presenters. And those questions will most likely be answered at the end, but they might be picked up in the middle if they're relevant, or if the presenters want to address them at the moment. And then some other things to note: in the top right, you have a little button that says view, and that can change what you see on your screen. If you select side-by-side speaker, that will show you the presentation along with whoever the presenter is at the moment, if you want to also watch them as they present. But you can feel free to just keep it as standard, and that will just make the presentation full screen. We'll also be playing audio clips of bird calls and bird sounds. So please turn your volume up. And if you have any trouble hearing those bird sounds or bird calls, feel free to raise a hand, or you can shoot me a text message or an email, and I'll put those in the chat right now. My email is jack@vlt.org, and my phone number is 802-661-8485. And with that, if there's anything else to add before we begin, Caitlin, Steve, I'll let you take it away.
Great. Thanks, Jack. Good evening, everybody, and thanks for joining us here this evening. It's great to have so many folks interested in talking about birds tonight and learning a little bit more about a group of birds that we call the Birders Dozen, and more to come on what that is here in just a little bit. But as Jack said, I work with Audubon Vermont, and Audubon Vermont is the state program of the National Audubon Society. Our mission, quite simply, is to protect birds in the places they need today and tomorrow. And so what we'll be really focusing on tonight, as in terms of the place that those birds need, are forests. The forests, not just of Vermont, but really the greater Northeast, the northern forest region of Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, the Adirondack Park, Massachusetts, northwestern Connecticut in particular, is really where a lot of the core bird habitat for the birds that we'll be taking a look at here this evening go and spend their summer months. So really great to be here with you all, and we'll dive right into it. So probably it's not a surprise to pretty much everybody on here this evening that that Vermont, we are a forest state. Approximately 80% of our landscape is covered in forests. Like, this is a photo from the top of Mount Hunger, just a stone's throw really from where I live. And the forests that we have throughout the state, folks are also probably familiar with some of the things that we are known for in those forests. And those could be things like our timber products, high quality timber products that come out of our forest, or our non-timber forest products like we see on the right here, our Vermont maple syrup. And I will note that this is Caitlin and her husband's maple operation, Little Hogback Farm. Jack mentioned we're bird-friendly maple producers, both Caitlin and I. And that's a little, you'll see on the bottle there on the left side, you'll see a little red bird, which is a scarlet tanager, to denote their participation in a program that we've started at Audubon to recognize producers who think about birds when they're managing their woods for maple syrup production. People also think about us in our forest for the fall foliage that we have, the brilliant oranges and yellows and reds that really kind of take over and cause a lot of people to want to come and visit with us during the fall season. And then finally, the recreational aspects. These are my two kids on our property, which is actually our forest property, which is in the town of Moortown. But here we are last spring taking a nice walk up there in the early season. So these are things that a lot of people are familiar with when they think about Vermont and forests. But one of the things that fewer people tend to think about or tend to realize is that those same forests also are critical breeding habitat, nesting habitat for a wide diversity of species, whether it be our state bird, the hermit thrush, which is there on the left, or maybe a lesser known bird, the Blackburnian warbler, which we see on the right, that brilliant orangish yellow coloration that we see there on the throat. These are just two birds that are kind of emblematic of the many species that we find in our forests. And our forests are really, when it comes to it, really globally important for birds. I'm going to show you this graphic here, this map, which kind of just is used to illustrate the importance of our forest for birds during the nesting season. This shows the data from a program called the North American Breeding Bird Survey. And these colors represent the number of forest bird species that are kind of encountered on breeding bird survey routes, the mean or average number of species encountered during those routes. And you'll see that northern New England, the Adirondacks, and then the upper Midwest, kind of down through New York State, are really where we find some of the highest numbers of bird species, what we refer to as species richness, of anywhere else in the country when it comes to forest birds. Of course, if you're out in the forest right now, you may find it hard to believe that there are so many birds because there's really not a lot of bird song, bird sounds that we'll find in the forest right now. And the reason for that is there aren't as many of them here right now. Many of the species that make up that high richness that I just showed you on the map are migratory in nature. And so some of those aren't even in our forest yet. A lot of them, those migratory species, are actually what we refer to as neotropical migrants. And the example of that would be this bird, the black-throated blue warbler, which we're going to learn a little bit more about this one later on in the presentation. But just as kind of an example of what we mean by neotropical migrants, it's essentially a species in which the majority of the wintering population for that bird goes south of the Tropic of Cancer, and the majority of the breeding population comes back north of the Tropic of Cancer. So you'll see this bird winters mainly in the Caribbean islands, and right now is on its way in migration. You'll see the kind of the yellow coloration on the map that shows where it doesn't breed or winter, but it moves through in migration. Birds are starting to do that right now. So that bird is on its way back up to its breeding territory. And once they get here, then we'll start to become a lot more aware of their presence, and our forest will come alive with the songs and the colors that those birds bring with them. And when we think about conservation of birds or conservation of really anything, whether any wildlife species, we often think about species that are doing poorly in terms of their populations. So at Audubon, we have a number of species that we focus our conservation efforts on. We call them priority species, or another term we use sometimes are responsibility species. And some of those birds fit into that category quite well. They are declining, both in Vermont and oftentimes throughout their range. And just an example of that is this bird, the Canada warbler. According to the Vermont Center for Eco Studies and their report, the status of Vermont forest birds, it was a 25-year study that they published in 2017. Canada warblers in Vermont have decreased by 71% over that time period. And that time period is 1989 to 2013 that data was collected on them. So some of our priority or responsibility species are in that declining category. But we also have birds. Let me actually go back here just one second. When we work to kind of restore populations that are declining, I think of that as, we'll call that reactive conservation. So we are reacting to a conservation problem that we have today. Oftentimes it takes quite a considerable amount of resources in order to be effective in achieving your conservation outcomes. The other group of birds that we put into our priority species list are birds that are actually doing okay. So this bird, the black-throated green warbler, again, with that same Vermont Center for Eco Studies data, has increased in Vermont by 57% in the last 25 years. So it's actually doing quite well. So you might wonder, well, why is it a priority for us? Why is it a bird that we pay attention to? Well, it's because for the black-throated green warbler, we in Vermont, and really throughout the Northeast, we're the core of their breeding range. So a high percentage of that species breeding or nesting population comes back to our forests every year. So we play actually a globally important role in making sure that we can provide habitat for those birds so that when they get here, they're successfully able to raise their young. So this would be what I would refer to as an example of being proactive conservation. Doesn't take as much in terms of resources to kind of maintain a population than it does to bring it back. So those are two different categories that the birds that we focus on through our work, our healthy forest programs at Audubon really fall into those two categories, either declining species population-wise or the species that are doing okay, but we are at the core of their breeding habitat. And so we have over 40 species that we really kind of think about, but we've distilled that down. It's a lot of birds for us to keep track of and to get together folks to think about. So we've distilled that down to a group of 12 that we refer to as the Birder's Dozen, and that's what we'll be focusing on tonight. Those 12 birds were identified really under one of two categories. One is that they are relatively easy. We'll put the emphasis on relatively easy to identify by sight and or sound compared to some other species. And then the second thing is that they do utilize a wide range of forest conditions. So young forest, more mature forest, and then they key in on different structural features of the forest that we'll get into as well. But they also, and I didn't put a bullet here, but they kind of, you pick one of those Birder's Dozen, and there's a whole suite of other species that if we think about the habitat for that one Birder's Dozen species, we're going to be able to enhance habitat for a bunch of other birds along the way. So we don't really take a single species focus to our work. It's more of looking at a wider range of habitat conditions and the birds that come along with that. So we are going to start off. We're going to take a little bird walk virtually here, take a tour, and I'm going to invite you to kind of score yourself, play along at home, where you can, as we see some images and hear some sounds of these birds, you'll have an opportunity to kind of say to yourself, do I know what this is? You'll hear a couple clues about it, maybe some information briefly about the species to help you along if you think you know, and then you finally realize what it is. And so we'll do that, and then we'll share with you a chart. And at the end, you can kind of score yourself. So there's 12 different species. You'll see, did I get 12 out of 12, 100%? Did I get 10 out of 12? What did you get? And it's okay. We won't actually score you. It's just a way for you to kind of play along at home. So we're going to start with birds that use during the nesting season what we refer to as young forest habitat. And really when we're talking about, another term sometimes people use for this is early successional habitat. And really what that means, it's a structural condition. It's a condition of the forest that, as you can see here, in this case, if you're standing in this place in the summertime and the sun is out, you're probably going to get pretty hot because there's not a lot of high canopy cover overhead. There may be some scattered trees here and there, but otherwise it's an open canopy. Because of that, you get a lot of really dense young growth coming in underneath. So you'll get raspberries and blackberries and shrubs and trees, seedlings and saplings. It creates this very dense structure of vegetation down low. And that's exactly what our young forest nesting bird species are looking for when they are trying to find a place to nest. So we have 3 bird species from our Birder's Dozen that need this kind of habitat condition in order to find nesting habitat. So here we go with the first one. And we're starting off with a bird that, I mentioned before, there's not a lot of birds in our forest yet because of the migratory nature of them. Well, there are some, and this is one that is a migrant, but it doesn't go that far. It's not a neotropical migrant. So it kind of just goes down the East Coast, stays in the States, but it has returned to Vermont, and it typically returns sometime during maple sugaring season. So I know that when I'm boiling here at my place, I can go out and listen in the backfield at dusk, and I might be able to hear this bird going through its courtship display. So this is actually a shorebird. It's not one of the brightly colored songbirds that a lot of the ones we'll be talking about are, but this is a shorebird, an upland shorebird. So we don't find it on the coast. We find it in our forests, in our open fields. You'll see that long bill. is used for probing into the soil where it finds worms and other macroinvertebrates and things that it feeds on. And the sound that this bird makes, it's pretty distinctive. And so we're going to play. Hopefully everybody will be able to hear this. If not, as Jack mentioned, either put it in the chat or send him a note so that we can try to change that and make it work for everybody. So we're going to hear a couple things, and I'm just going to let you take a listen to it here. So it starts with this kind of meh, this painting. Now we've got this sort of twittering sound. And this is actually the bird now taking off and flying up into the air. The sound is wind, air moving through its outer flight feathers. Now there's a little bit of chirp in there. And the chirping are vocalizations again, but we still hear that twittering of sound through the feathers. So it flies way up high in the sky, right at dusk, and then it comes back down and peents when it lands. And that's the male. It's doing its courtship display. So it's trying to be attracting a mate, a female, and that's how it goes about it. And the really cool thing is when they do take off, you'll see them going for a little bit, and then as that dusk sky, you'll lose them, and then they'll start kind of falling back down to earth, and they land pretty much exactly where they took off from, which is a kind of a neat feature. So I'll let you think about this bird for another couple seconds here before we share with you what it is. I will tell you a nickname is the timber doodle. Timber doodle is nickname for the American woodcock. So if you got that one right, you can score yourself. You've got +1 to start here this evening. All right, so now we're going to move ahead. Oh, I did want to share this. So this came from, this is a photo from a forester, Brendan Moore, who used to be a forester here in Vermont, and he came across this group of young woodcock, and I just wanted to share it because they're absolutely adorable, but secondly, you can just see how camouflaged they are. And as a ground nesting species, that's really important so that it's much harder for a predator to find you. So that would be happening right around this time of year, that we'd be having woodcock starting to get their young out there on the forest floor. So now we get to one of the songbirds. So this is a much smaller species. So the woodcock is kind of a very, very small, say chicken-sized bird. But this bird is even much smaller than that. And as we look at these birds, we're gonna be looking kind of at two different things. We're gonna look at field marks, we're gonna look at physical characteristics about them, and then we're gonna be listening to their songs and trying to come up with some mnemonics, which are words that we use to describe those songs to help us remember them. And so the key field marks with this particular species, and by the way, I should note, with this bird and quite a few of them, the birds that have the bright colors, those are the males of the species. And that's because males want to stand out. They want to attract a mate. They want to let other males of their species know, hey, I've claimed this area. This is my territory. Whereas the female, who is often the one on the nest, does not want to stand out. So they tend to be a little bit more muted down in terms of their coloration, and sometimes can look quite a bit different than the males do. So in terms of field marks for this bird, first thing you'll probably note is that really bright yellow cap there on top of its head. And then on the side of this bird, let's see if my mouse here, hopefully you can see my arrow. We've got this chestnut colored side. So a chestnut side, I'm kind of throwing some clues at you to help you off here to get started in terms of the name of this bird. So this is the chestnut-sided colored bird to it. Let's listen to the song. And this song, I want you to listen for it saying, please, please, pleased to meet ya. So this bird is please, please, pleased to meet ya. Let's see if you can hear that. Really fast. Please, 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 pleased to meet ya. Excuse me. So that's the male. That would be the male doing that that song. That please, please, pleased to meet you. It's a bird. I call this kind of the poster bird for that young forest condition. So whenever we have an area of that that we saw earlier, that kind of open canopy, I didn't mention that you need to have an area that's close to 2 acres in size of that kind of condition in order for it to be attractive to these young forest species. So if you just had a small little quarter-acre opening in your forest that got a lot of young growth coming in well, you're probably not going to find these young forest birds. So you need a larger area. Typically, it's at least an acre, but to be even better, it's 2 acres or more. So if we have that kind of condition over 2 acres or more, almost guaranteed in Vermont, you're going to find this particular bird. And this one, remember how I said I had the chestnut-sided there to it? Well, that's the giveaway. This is the chestnut-sided warbler. And so warblers are it's a group of birds. There's a lot of different species that fall under the warbler name. They're the ones that people get what they call warbler neck, where they're kind of looking up with their binoculars, trying to find the bird that's singing. So this bird would be nesting down in that really low dense cover, but it does like some taller trees in there or nearby where the male can get up and sing from, so that song will broadcast a little bit further. And then the last bird from our young forest area, this is actually one of my favorites. I have to be careful because I'll often say for many of these that it's one of my favorites. So there are 12 of my favorites in this presentation tonight. But this bird is also in that young forest, particularly where there's going to be kind of some down woody material. So like brush piles, we've heard about people making brush piles for wildlife. That's a great feature of the habitat within those young forest habitats in order for this bird to be found there. It's not a necessity, but it often will enhance the habitat for them. Key field marks here is this kind of yellow coloration between the eye and the bill, and then this white throat that it has. Again, white throat is going to be a helpful hint for remembering the name of this particular species. It's in the same group of birds that, very common in towns and urban areas. We've got those sparrows that kind of seem to be everywhere. Well, this is going to be a relative to that. And then the song, I will say, now this is actually one of my favorite bird songs of all. I call it the Song of the North Woods. You'll hear it pretty much throughout the Northeast, anywhere where there's that really low dense cover. So you could be at the top of Mount Mansfield where you get that low growing, it's called Krumholtz, the spruce that really grows dense. You'll hear it up there, and you'll hear it down in the lowlands as well, in that young, low dense growing young forest habitat. So the Song of the North Woods, it says, "Poor Sam Peabody, Peabody, Peabody. And north of the border, they say, oh, sweet Canada, Canada, Canada." So the Song of the North Woods, that is our white-throated sparrow. Let me get back to, oh, come on here. All right, and so with that, as the white-throated sparrow kind of takes us out of the young forest habitat, I'm going to turn it over to Caitlin. And she's going to, one of the things that we really think about, get this bird to stop singing. Okay, it did. One of the things we really think about when we're talking about conservation of these species, these birds, it's really a lot about habitat management to make sure the conditions these birds need are represented out there on the ground. And oftentimes we can do that through active forest management. And so Caitlin's going to talk to us a little bit about some of the efforts that Vermont Land Trust has done to help to achieve that. Caitlin?
Awesome. Thanks, Steve, and thanks everybody for joining us tonight. So Steve, if you want to go to the next slide, I'm just going to share a quick example with you of an opportunity that the Vermont Land Trust did to create young forest habitat on one of our properties that we own in Waitsfield. It's a 98-acre property, and for those familiar with the Mad River Valley, our northern boundary is Ralston Road and our southern boundary is Folsom Brook. And you'll see here the red line delineates a 2,500 acre area. And this is a unit that is used by bird conservation by that community to delineate sort of the landscape context for bird habitat. And so as you'll see, when you look at this aerial photo, a lot of that landscape is around our property is really a mix of like mature forest, agricultural land, and residential developments. And there's not a lot of young forest in that area that could support the species that Steve just discussed. And so over the course of 2 winters, my colleague, Dan Kilborn, who's on tonight, hi, Dan, he conducted a timber sale, and this was in 2008 to 2010 during those 2 winters. The main methods that were used were to remove single or small groups of trees. And that really mimics wind or ice disturbance in our woods. That's sort of a dominant pattern. And so those smaller openings, though, that were created tend to favor species like sugar maple and beech that tend to be more shade tolerant. The groups were generally less than 1/4 of an acre, but there was an opportunity where Dan was finding some of the white pines were slowly getting blown over by the wind within this area, this 2-acre area. And so decided that would actually make a good place to create an opening. And that opening offered an opportunity to salvage that white pine. It offered an opportunity to create a larger opening for species that need a lot more sun to establish and grow, species like birch and cherry and ash. And here, what we're talking about tonight, it offered a great opportunity to create some wildlife habitat, some young forest habitat for these species. So Steve, if you will hop on to the next one. There we go. All right, awesome. So this is a picture Dan took, and this would have been the summer after the harvest was completed. And so a couple of things I just wanted to point out here. One, you'll notice Dan didn't mark and have removed all of the trees within this opening. He left a number of trees. He left white pine and ash and hemlock, and these trees serve multiple functions. The trees serve as perch sites for chestnut-sided warblers. They serve, and other songbirds, they also serve as perch sites for predators like owls. They also are going to provide the seed for that next generation of forests to establish. You'll also notice a lot of the down wood on the ground. That is something Steve talked about. That provides great cover, foraging habitat for birds, but it also provides great habitat for small mammals, amphibians, and a lot of other wildlife. I'll point out in the middle, you'll see a snag, meaning a standing dead tree, which is great wildlife habitat. And that's going to be sort of my reference point for you for the next slides, so you can follow sort of how we're progressing. So Steve, if you don't mind forwarding us. So here we are 4 years later, 2014. You'll see the trees and shrubs have established well. There's our snag, there's your reference point. And now this is providing nesting habitat for chestnut-sided warblers who are going to nest around, in that shrub and saplings, roughly about 6 feet off the ground. And then the white-throated sparrow that Steve had talked about, he's going to be, or she, I should say, is going to be mainly sort of on the forest edge, a little bit lower on the ground. But again, this is, 4 years later, and we're already creating nesting habitat for these species. And so Steve, if you don't mind just doing one more. So this is now. And as you can see, things are really regenerating or growing and establishing really well. There's your snag in the middle. There's your trees that were retained for perching or for seed, and things are really coming along. That we're nearing sort of the window for this opening to provide that young forest habitat for chestnut-sided warblers and white-throated sparrows is closing. Yet, as a segue into our next topic, this is now it's moving into a place of providing habitat for our next suite of species. So I think, Steve, if we could, there's one question we have in the Q&A. So maybe if we could ask that, and then we'll move on to mature forest. And Dan, if I missed anything, chime in the chat. Add any more fun details for folks. So this is from Jane. We live on 300 acres in Waterbury and have it in current use doing logging for the forester. Does that help with this type of habitat? So maybe you could talk, Steve, about how current use and management,
Yeah, absolutely. Great that you're right here in Waterbury. So active management, active forestry, kind of as Caitlin's been talking here, is a really great tool in our toolkit for enhancing habitat for any of the birders dozen species and others too as well. It really gets down to thinking about, in terms of which species are going to benefit, it's thinking about the types of forest management that you actually implement, or in forestry terms, what's the silviculture that you implement, that you use? How are we cutting trees? How are how big are openings if we're doing openings? So if your current use forest management plan, which is an awesome program to be involved with, if you qualify, if it calls for kind of some of these larger openings, then you have potentially going to be creating young forest habitat conditions. If the forest management plan calls for some smaller openings that are in more of the less than an acre in size, or if it just calls for kind of single tree removals, then we're going to be talking more about enhancing habitat for the next group of birds we're going to be learning about, which is our more mature forest habitat species. But that's a long answer to your question, which is yes. Current use, active forest management, a harvest that's happening are all good tools that we have at our disposal for enhancing habitat for these species and achieving a whole wealth of other forestry objectives.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Hey,
great. Sorry, were you going to say something?
Well, I was just going to say, before we move off of the young forest topic here, I just wanted to mention that, you know, as your photos show, you know, this is a very recent photo compared to the ones that were taken back when the harvest happened and then a few years later. These young forest conditions are very ephemeral, so they only last for a certain amount of time, as you kind of alluded to, Caitlin, before the forest matures to a point where that chestnut-sided warbler says, you know what, this isn't right anymore. So it either has to find another place that is right, or, well, it has to find another place that's right. It has to go somewhere, and it could be short distance, or it could be a much further distance that it needs to travel in order to find those conditions. So if we want young forest species on the ground, we have to have some kind of a disturbance to the forest that creates these openings that will then result in the structure that we're looking for. And that can be active harvesting of trees, or it can also happen naturally with wind events and ice storms, things like that.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. And there's not too many more opportunities on this property, but there is one more that we will take advantage of this winter, creating another large opening so that chestnut-sided can move. It doesn't have to move far.
Right. Good. Okay.
Awesome. Okay. So back at it.
Yeah. So we'll
appreciate folks putting the questions in the Q&A. Wonderful. We'll get to more questions at the end. So thank you for continue to sort of add those in there.
Right. So we'll continue our walk now. Now we're going to move into what we're going to refer to as a mature forest habitat. And I want to make sure that we give a definition for mature forest in the context of thinking about habitat in birds here in particular. Mature doesn't necessarily mean that the trees are economically at their largest, you know, their highest value. Sometimes people can think about it in that way. It doesn't mean that it's an old growth forest per se. It just essentially means it's a condition, once again, just like the young forest was a condition, a structural condition. Mature forest is when we have what we see here. This is actually a really nice mature forest example. We have relatively high canopy, so the trees overhead, we go up, look up there, they're 60 feet plus. On a nice hot sunny day, this is actually where we can go to find some refuge where it's cooler because of the shade that exists because of that high canopy. And then we can have other layers of vegetation as well, what we refer to as that structure. We don't always see different layers of vegetation in mature forest, but for the best habitat, it'd be what we were looking for. So really when we have this relatively high 60-foot plus tall canopy that's pretty closed in, it's nice and shaded, now we've got habitat for a totally different suite of forest birds, birders dozen species that are going to be looking to come in here. They're going to look to see if the habitat features that they key in on are available. And if they are, they might try to set up a territory and raise their young. So let's take a walk. We'll pull up our binoculars and tune our ears in, and we'll see what we can come up with here. All right, so the first bird that we're noticing, that this again being a bird that is a neotropical migrant. Not all members of this species do go south of the Tropic of Cancer. Some do stay in Florida in the southeast, but some of them do go further south into Central America. This is one of our earliest arriving neotropical migrants. So it is here in Vermont now, and I have learned just through kind of observation that I can set my clock to somewhere around April 22nd to April 26th or so, when I will first start to hear this bird in our forests. And it's pretty fun to do that. You'll know when these species are returning. So despite the fact that we had such a warm March, the weather's been so erratic, this bird, where it was wintering, didn't know what it was like up here. So they weren't really arriving earlier. They arrived right on cue because they're being spurred on in their migration by other cues that they're getting, length of day and other internal things that we're certainly not aware of as humans, that kind of tell them when it's the right time to go. It's not necessarily that it's warm and they say, oh, it's time to head up north. So this particular bird, you'll see it's in a pine tree, and it does associate with softwoods, conifers, mature forests that have a component of softwood or all softwoods. So that's a really key feature for them. They also really need a well-developed, what we refer to as mid-story layer. So these are trees that are like up to 30 feet tall in the forest, because that's where it will place its nest. And in terms of the field marks for this particular bird, it has what we refer to as a spectacle. So it's kind of got this white line that goes from the base of the bill or over the top of the eye, wraps around, but it stops, it falls just short of making a complete circle. So that's kind of a thing you can look for and notice. The cousin, I call it the cousin, another related species of this bird, is very common in our forest a little bit later on. So this is the kind of a more subdued cousin. I'll get to that in just a second, but let's listen to the song. Kind of a slow and very thoughtful. And so the mnemonic that I often use for this bird is, it says, here I am, look at me, up here in the trees, but it's very slow. Now the bird that's related to this, that will come a little bit later and is very, very common, found more in the hardwood forest, is called the red-eyed vireo. And it sings a very similar song, but it's much faster. So it's, here I am, look at me, up here in the trees, and it just goes and goes and goes kind of all day long. This one's a little bit slower, a little more thoughtful, and thinks before it speaks, I say. And so it's not a red-eyed vireo, but it is the blue-headed vireo. And in the old bird books, it'll say solitary vireo, but it's the same species as the blue-headed vireo. So it's here now. Go out into the forest where you have some softwoods and listen for that kind of slow, thoughtful, here I am, look at me up here in the trees. All right. So we'll move along now to a different, vireo, again, that's like the warbler we mentioned in the young forest. Vireos is another category, another group of species. So now we're going to look at a group of birds that falls into a different category. These are the thrushes of our forest. And there are 3 forest thrushes that we might find down at kind of the elevations where most of us live. If we go up high, like the top of Mount Mansfield, we might find the Bicknell's thrush. But down here in our lower elevations, in our hardwood and mixedwood forest, we have 3 different ones. And so this is one that we will often find. It's kind of key field marks are the spotting, the dark spots on the white breast and stomach area and down the sides. These spots are very noticeable, very stark, well-defined, easy to kind of see the individual spots on them. And the song, I think this is, again, it's one of my favorites, but the white-throated sparrow is my favorite. But this one certainly got a lot going for it as well. Scroll over here. So that's kind of this very flute-like eole sort of sound to it. And then it ends there, that last part, with what we call the shattering glass, that at the end. So this again, flute-like is really the best way to describe it. Eole is the word, the mnemonic that will go along with it. So of our 3 lowland forest thrushes, we already were introduced to one of them earlier in the presentation, which is not one of the birders dozen. That was the hermit thrush. So that leaves just 2 other ones. And so this one happens to be, if you're keeping score at home, you would say the wood thrush. And this is a bird, you know, I haven't really been talking about the kind of the population status of many of these birds, but wood thrush is a bird that is declining really throughout its entire breeding range. And this bird, we'll find it all the way to the Mississippi River. And throughout that entire area, populations have been declining steadily year after year for the last 40 plus years that we've been keeping good records of them. So great when you can hear that wood thrush in the forest. And then the other forest thrush is in our birders dozen. It's this one here. So very similar to the wood thrush in terms of that brown colored back, kind of a light colored breast and chest and stomach area there. But notice the spotting on this one is very much more subdued. You can kind of, they're not spots so much as more of a wash of a bright brown coloration there. And it's shown here by a stream. That's not necessarily where you have to find it, but you will often hear this bird along streams and waterways, particularly at dusk and dawn. So at dusk in particular. So you'll hear, I know sometimes I like to go, I live right across the street from Thatcher Brook, and I like to go down there and try to catch some little brook trout on a dry fly, and we'll hear this particular bird down there, which is fun. So this song is, it's really fun to listen for. And it does kind of say its name as when it's making it. So listen and see what you can hear in this. Kind of a veer, 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 spiraling down. Kind of a spiraling downward veer, 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 veer. Veer, veer, there was a good one at the end there. So if you know your forest thrushes and you know it's not a hermit thrush and it's not a wood thrush, that means that it must be a veery. So not even having thrush in its name, but it is one of our 3 lowland forest thrushes. So that is that bird. And again, the key, they do like that low dense vegetation too, but not necessarily really in the young forest habitat, although they can be found there. But listen for them along particular waterways here as we get further into the spring. Okay, so now we're going to switch gears to a different category of birds. This bird has a relative that many of you probably are familiar with. Maybe you even have the relative to this bird nesting up under the eaves of your porch or your shed or your barn. They come back pretty early in the spring. Again, the relative, not this one. And they make that mossy, muddy nest and right over the door where you want to go in and out all the time, and they happen to be there with their young. And that's the phoebe that does that. This is the forest cousin that we find not around our homes so much as more in the forest. And it likes to find kind of these openings, these gaps in a forested area, mature forest, where there's a lot of sunlight coming down in, and henceforth a lot of insects flying around. And so as a flycatcher in that group of birds, this is a bird that will perch on an edge of one of those openings or gaps. It'll fly out and grab an insect on the wing and go back and feed on it. And all of these flycatchers, you can't really see it in this photo, but they have these kind of, they look like almost like hairs sticking out here from the base of their bill, but they're not really feathers. They don't have a vein like other feathers do there, but they're very bristly things there. And many people used to think those were for, as the bird opened its mouth to try to fly and catch an insect, that would help to funnel insects into the mouth. But it's actually been shown through some studies that it doesn't really do that, because this bird will catch insects more in the tip of its bill than it will by a wide open gaping mouth. So the thought is that maybe those hair-like bristles are used to kind of help it just to orient itself. It's more of a sensory thing, so know how fast is it moving, what direction it's moving, things like that. It may be one of those things we just don't know or never will know, and I think that's okay as well. Now this bird does say its name. when it sings, which is a really cool part of it. Take a listen. It says, "Pee-wee." Pee-wee, pee-wee. So the forest version of the eastern phoebe is going to be pewee, the eastern wood pewee. So that's our flycatcher representative to our birders dozen. All right. Now we get to a spot where, you know, those standing dead trees or snags that Caitlin showed in that young forest opening. Standing dead trees or even live trees that have some decay in them that birds can excavate cavities for nesting in. This is our lone cavity nesting bird in the birders dozen. This is the adult on the left and a juvenile on the right. This is the male who has the red cap and kind of the red throat patch as well. And this bird is also here right now. It has returned to our forest. Again, I think of it as a bird that arrives sometime during late sugaring season. It tends to be heard pretty easily because it will find the most resonant surface it can to drill its beak on. It's not a songster, so it uses its drumming as part of its courtship. So it'll find things like siding of your house, stop sign, or other metal sign, the metal roof on your sugar house or your woodshed in order to make those sounds that it needs. And it'll sound a little something like this. And there's one calling back. Sounds like somebody at a typewriter. Oh, and there's that squawk. Characteristic squawk that goes along. And there's a bunch of them squawking. You'll know if you come across a nest of these in the forest, because the young tend to not be so concerned if they make a lot of noise or not. They'd be pretty vocal, making that squawking sound. And so the lone in the woodpecker family cavity nesting bird that we have in our birders dozen is the yellow-bellied sapsucker. And our only migratory woodpecker species. So our pileated, our hairies, and our downy woodpeckers that are quite common, those are here year-round. Yellow-bellied sapsucker does migrate. All right. In terms of visual appearance, this has to be probably one of my favorites. This is the male of the species. I'm going to kind of speed things up a little bit here. We go along, we'll jump right into the, this is, kind of, I call this the black-winged redbird instead of the red-winged blackbird. Helps people especially young people to remember it. Scroll over here. Now this bird's going to sound a bit like a robin, but it's a robin with a sore throat. It's kind of got a huskiness to it. And then there's a key part of it. So if you're in the forest and you hear what sounds like a robin, but it's a little scratchy, and then you hear this other kind of part to the song, which I think you'll pick up on, you'll know that it's this species. Here it comes. Chick-burr, chick-burr. There it was. So the robin, husky robin with a chick-burr every once in a while mixed in there will tell us that we have found the beautiful scarlet tanager. And up against the brilliant blue sky, when you see one of these, it's pretty impressive sight. Okay, this bird we already saw earlier in our presentation. We were talking about how it's increased by 57% its population in Vermont over the last 25 years. This is one of the warblers. I'm just going to share it because we already learned its name. It's the black-throated green warbler. But I wanted to play the song for you. It's a kind of a buzziness to it, but I want you to listen to it. It goes up and down, like the Green Mountains of Vermont. So, Z, 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 zoo, Z. Z, 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 Z. And that's one way that someone taught me once to remember this one. Z, 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 Zoo, Z, just kind of up and down like the Green Mountains. So that's our black-throated green warbler. And this one we've also been introduced to a little earlier on, if you remember. Has a similar sort of buzzy song to it, but unlike the black-throated green, it kind of goes up and down like the Green Mountains. This one just rises up. Zip, 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 rises up in pitch up to the blue sky. So instead of being the black-throated green warbler, it is the black-throated blue. So it rises, that song just kind of rises up to the blue sky. And I find that was really helpful for me when I was starting to learn these songs. And then the last one, this is our bird that has really declined the most. I shared it with you earlier in the presentation. It has declined by, I have like the notes here, by almost 71% in Vermont over the last 25 years. This bird has a very special kind of unique niche habitat that it looks for. We often find it in what we think of as referred to as forested wetlands. So there are places in a forest where you have kind of perennial wet areas with these hummocks of land that stick up that maybe are mossy. The canopy is probably a little lower in there than it is throughout the rest of the forest. There could be some standing water. And that's really the key for this bird, which is the Canada warbler, again, as we learned about it before. So really important for us when we think about if we have this bird around, we know that we're providing habitat for it. Based on the fact it's declining so much, we want to make sure we protect those areas, those forested wetlands, as much as possible for lots of reasons, but one being certainly from this bird's perspective. The song is, it's a tricky one. The mnemonic for it is, I'm in here, but you can't see me. That's what a lot of people say. I have a little harder time figuring this one out, but I'll let you see what you think. I'm in here, but you can't see me. Maybe, maybe not. Or you can come up with your own. All right. So that is our birders dozen. But once again, thinking about how do we work to protect these birds and make sure that they persist on the landscape, it's a lot about thinking about the places they need, and that being high quality forest habitat. So I'm going to turn it back over to Caitlin again to share some other examples from the Vermont Land Trust of things that are being done to help these species out.
Awesome. Thanks, Steve. It's exciting to hear them and see them and I get really excited, like they're going to be here soon. So this is great. So I'll just wrap us up here with just another quick example for everyone, just so you can see how one could manage for these mature forest species. So this, the property outlined in yellow here on your screen, is a 72-acre property in South Starksboro, so Addison County, near just 15 minutes from here. And you'll see again that 2,500-acre landscape surrounding it is mostly mature forests. There's definitely some residential development throughout there, but not a lot of young forest, again, like the sort of Rose property. So Steve came out in 2015 and did a bird habitat assessment for us. And what Steve found was, in walking around our woods, that there really wasn't a well-developed understory, again, from the ground to about 5 feet. That's what we call the understory layer. There weren't a lot of snags or cavity trees, and those could really be enhanced to provide better habitat for a lot of the birds that he just shared with us. Again, he also recommended, because of that lack of young forest, that might be another thing that we'd want to address. So next slide, please, Steve. So when I updated the management plan in 2018, I incorporated Steve's recommendations. And this winter, we actually conducted a harvest to implement a lot of those recommendations, as well as a myriad of other goals. And so those are listed here. One of our goals was to really increase the diversity of species and ages. And that really ties in also to the other goal of increasing this forest resilience to climate change. That diversity can help really create a more resilient forest that can stand some of the stressors that may be ahead. In terms of the diversity as well, specifically for those of us in Bristol, we know we have the emerald ash borer. South Starksboro, as the crow flies, is not that far away. So I wanted to really also regenerate some ash as one of the strategies, multiple sort of multi-pronged strategies for hopefully conserving ash on our landscape. Enhance wildlife habitat, there's that forest bird habitat goal. Improve growing conditions for saw timber trees and generate income. I do want to give a shout out to the gentleman in the bottom right corner. That's Kyle Pratt, our logger, who with his crew of Josh and Tom really did an excellent job helping us meet these goals this winter. Okay, next one, Steve. So you'll see here, oops, if you want to go back, yeah, that's good. I just want to, one comment here. So like the Rose property, we mainly used sort of single tree and small groups of trees. We removed those in order to achieve our goals. But I created 5 larger openings that are the orange kind of blobs there. You'll see one is labeled a 3/4 acre opening, one is a 1/4 acre. So they ranged in size between those two ends. And that was to achieve some other goals, which I'll talk about in a minute when I share that example. One thing I didn't see the opportunity for, at least at this point, was to create a much larger opening of 2 acres that Steve had suggested. So that was one thing we did not do in this harvest, but there may be opportunities in the future to address that as well. Okay, next one, Steve. So what parts of this were for the birds? So I labeled a couple of the things. This is one of our smaller openings where we just removed a couple of trees. And you'll notice, a couple of things. One, in these smaller openings, like I shared before, what we're likely to see established here are the more shade tolerant species like sugar maple and beech. And that litter layer is really important for sugar maple because it really needs that moisture when it establishes. But that litter layer is also important for another bird that we didn't actually hear tonight, but I had to throw in there because I couldn't believe I actually stumbled upon this nest, and that's in the bottom right. That's the oven bird, which you'll see it makes a nest that, son of a gun, it looks like an oven. So that's one that does need the litter layer. A veery, what we talked about tonight, again, that is one that will forage and nest near the ground. So just wanted to sort of point that out. So other things that you'll notice the snag, and that's again is helpful for those cavity dependent species that Steve talked about, like the yellow-bellied sapsucker. The large diameter tree in the far left of the photo, that is a sugar maple legacy tree, and you'll have to just trust me, but there's a large cavity actually that you can see on the other side. Again, a great habitat for those cavity nesters and other wildlife too. It's a legacy tree, meaning it's a tree that will never remove from the forest, and so it will be left there to live out, its full tree life. And then of particular, importance these days is it's eventually going to become part of the soil carbon pool once it falls and decays. And then, you'll see also, it does look, I'm sure to your eye, it probably looks pretty messy, this opening, and that's intentional. So I asked Kyle and his crew not to cut down the tops. I asked them to leave them in place, as high as they could. Usually loggers will kind of limb up the tops so it's a little more aesthetically pleasing, and so it's a little more well distributed and not left in piles. And those tops are actually great for birds and for other wildlife for that matter. Once the sugar maples and other species start to establish in there, that black-throated blue is going to find a nice nesting site, in that sort of understory layer. So Steve, if you don't mind, great, thank you. And so, as I mentioned, most of our openings were small. I did want to share this larger opening. This is the 3/4 acre opening. And this is one I had mentioned. One of our goals was to really, hopefully, conserve some ash. And so ash really need a more light than those smaller openings can really afford it. And so that was one of the goals in this area. This was an area that we, again, like Dan, didn't remove all the trees in the opening. And so you'll notice I've labeled a yellow birch, which yellow birch in particular is a great tree that a lot of birds forage on, and is an important tree for birds. And so we left that there, not only for birds, but also that's going to provide seed to hopefully have some yellow birch established in this opening. Again, in addition to ash, the birches are other species that need more sunlight to be able to establish. So we hope to see those. We hope to see aspen in this opening as well. You'll notice the injured aspen, which I know you can't see in the photo, so you're just gonna have to trust me on this, but there is an injury on the top that, made me realize it's probably not long for this world. So I left it. So that's going to be a great snag in the future. And when that top comes down, that's going to be great, material on the forest floor that's going to provide a lot of habitat. And then you can see in the sort of forefront of this photo is just a large piece of kind of gnarly log that was left. And that was, again, another thing that I asked Kyle and his crew to leave, that if there were really low quality, large diameter trees, to just leave them on site and, not bother dragging them out. And those, again, is for great habitat. And so I wanted to, a lot of birds, especially once we get some tree and shrub species established in here, there are a lot of birds that are going to really benefit from this. One that I did want to give a shout out to that Steve had talked about previously was the eastern wood pewee, and that as a flycatcher, what Steve described is that this bird is going to now be able to kind of sally forth into this opening and feed on the insects that are flying around. So that's a bird that I think will particularly benefit from, an opening like this. But certainly, black-throated blue warblers, Canada warblers, and veeries will also, as that understory starts to develop, they're going to benefit from. And then the little sort of pull out in the bottom is that you can't see it on this, but to the right of this, on the edge of the opening, we did release some of the spruce that had established, this opening is near a photo point where there's a small group of spruce that every year I hear a blackburnian singing in. So if those that are familiar with that one, that is one that does have an association with softwood. So certain species will happily be able to nest in that spruce that's coming up. So final slide here, Steve. So there's Steve. And this is, I had to add this because this was Steve came out this winter to look at this harvest with me. And Steve is like sort of this, it's like the little bird in my ear that as I've looked at different properties that I manage for the Vermont Land Trust, it's sort of always that question and thinking about management, like, well, what about the birds? And so here's sort of our sort of recap of sort of forest management considerations for enhancing habitat for forest birds. And we'll share a landowner's guide and some other resources with you in a follow-up email. But, we think about the size of the openings. Who is that going to really, cater to? It's going to cater to different species. The young forest that we talked about earlier, that's really going to, cater to chestnut-sideds and white-throated. So that's, a 1 to 2 acre opening. Location, are these openings near the forest edge? Where are the wetlands, streams, other sensitive features that are also important habitat? How do we lay them out in relation to those other habitat features? Does it make sense silviculturally? I shared, Dan had observed, wow, this pine is just constantly getting blown over. So there were some other reasons, to put that young forest opening in there. And then can we retain species within these openings that serve different functions? Downwood, sort of in that case, sort of messes best. So let's, leave as much downwood as we can. And then, I know there was a question in the Q&A that'd be great to get to. These openings are also like prime invitations for invasive plants, and birds do spread some of these seeds. And so, it's something that we just have to, we don't, fortunately, I'll knock on wood, have not had, I've maybe seen a couple of barberries and one honeysuckle on this Jerusalem Skyline property in Starksboro. But now I know I'm going to have to look at these areas every year and look at the skid trails to make sure that I can remove plants as they become established. So with that, I think before we get into questions, we're a little bit over. So Jack has a couple announcements, and then for those that can hang on, would love to get to as many questions as we can.
Great, thanks Caitlin and Steve. Just want to plug two quick things before we get into the Q&A. The first is we will be sending out a survey, and we would love for you all to fill this out and tell us what you think, give us feedback. It helps us develop better programming for you all. So we do read each individual survey. So please take that and send it our way. The next thing we'd like to plug is for those who have made a donation already, thank you so much for your support. Vermont Land Trust is a membership organization that protects farms, forests, natural places, and recreational resources in Vermont. And we couldn't do this without you all as members and members of the public that are willing to donate to us. So please consider joining us today at Vermont Land Trust. And our link for that is vlt.org/donate, and I'll put that in the chat. And we do have some upcoming events to look out for. And these include a number of timely spring ephemeral, or spring wildflowers, I should say, on May 4th, a May 19th Women's Estate Planning webinar. And then for those birders out there, there's a June 9th Birding on Conserved Land event, as well as a Summer Wildflowers and their Pollinators event on June 23rd. And I'll put these links within, or we'll link to our events page in the email that we'll send out with the survey. But I think it's high time to jump into the Q&A.
Sounds great. Thanks, Jack. So we've got some great questions here. I want to, just in case the 7-year-old's bedtime is soon, I'd love to do this one first, Steve. Okay. This is the Macaulay Flippin family. And this, who writes, my son, 7 years old, is curious as to what tree species are best left standing for perching and seed.
Great question. So again, we often have to think about what are we trying to, what are our goals? What are the things we're trying to have as an outcome? And so if birds is one of those goals, Caitlin, it would be kind of what you had just spoke to. You know, yellow birch is a great tree for a lot of these birds because these birds are primarily insect eaters when they're here with us in the summer. And yellow birch has a large diversity of native insects that utilize it. So for these insect-eating songbirds, in particular, they really tend to gravitate and move towards, go and utilize these yellow birch trees as a food source. If we're thinking more about cavity trees for our woodpeckers, like our yellow-bellied sapsucker, then we'd want to think about trees that make good cavities, and those would be things like aspen or paper birch in particular. So, you know, and then the seed source, any trees, it could be a great seed source, and it just kind of depends what is it that you're trying to grow. What trees do you want to have? But those would two, yellow birch and then aspen or paper birch would be three species that that I would speak to. And of course, sugar maple.
Of course.
Right.
And I guess red maple too.
Yeah. But that was a great question. Thanks for it.
Yeah, awesome. And I'm like psyched to hear you say that, Steve, because I got 2 for 3 in that opening, yellow birch and aspen. So
there you go.
There you go.
Yep.
So question from Barbara, who says, how, and I think the question is, how do deer from overbrowsing and preventing understory growth? So maybe it's, you know, how do you deal with deer and prevent it from overbrowsing and preventing the understory growth? And I could add just one thing, Barbara, one, that was another thing I didn't mention, is that another goal of having the loggers leave those big tops was to ideally protect that region that was establishing. So yeah, great. Steve, what else do you love to hear what you
that would be my kind of my go-to answer there is you know, it's interesting to think about the relationships that exist between all parts of the forest ecosystem. We wouldn't necessarily think that a high deer population would impact negatively songbirds, but it can, right? So if we have a lot of deer, they're browsing on all the young growth that happens to be growing in that forest. It can really set back the ability to get that understory layer to develop, and therefore, think birds like black-throated blue and veery wouldn't find the habitat that they need. So yeah, definitely leaving that down woody material, the tops of trees after a harvest can really protect that, what we call regeneration of young trees, so that the deer don't get to it. And then eventually it grows up high enough where it gets out of the reach of deer. You know, and another thing too, the cultural tradition of hunting. You know, it's an important part of its habitat, its wildlife management. So if you are willing to do that, that's another option that exists for helping to control that.
Great, thanks, Steve. Linda was wondering, is the arrival date for some of the birds changing with climate change?
Yeah, you know, it's a great question, and I don't think we know enough yet about it. My general sense is that the answer for these longer distance migrants is no, right? We kind of talked about that with the blue-headed vireo. That blue-headed vireo, or even say the black-throated blue warbler, the wood thrush that are right now, you know, they're on their way, but they were in Central America, in some cases even South America, not aware of how climate change is affecting their breeding grounds. And so their migration is triggered by these internal clocks they have, more so than what the weather is up here, and you know, over longer terms, the climate. But the shorter distance migrants, birds that might be spending the winter in the mid-Atlantic, they may be kind of being pushed, given the clues to push forward northward earlier than normal because of how the climate has changed. So I'd say longer distance migrants, maybe not so much yet. Shorter distance migrants, maybe.
Great, thank you.
Can I just add to that too? Like that's a significant concern about birds arriving at different times than when those first insect hatches occur, right? Like we get this big, like I've already noticed today, there were black flies already starting to come out. It seems kind of early. And when we get those kind of big hatches of insects early in the season before the birds get here, that's a mismatch in what we call phenology, of the timing of natural events. And that could be a particularly negative consequence for birds that rely on those big insect hatches to feed on when they get here from migration.
Great, thanks, Steve. Great points. I just want to share, Pat Haller just wanted to share this info for folks. And again, we'll follow up with an email that NRCS's EQIP program has helped them pay for 3 treatments on their property. 2 were these 2-acre openings, patch cuts, like I mentioned, and the third was part or parcel of the patch cut, and that was to pay for invasive species control. In the end, it cost them $0. The landowner does have to pay the cost up front, but they covered 100%. So just to throw that out there as a resource that Pat has had good experience with.
Yep. Another tool in the toolkit is getting that financial assistance. That's great.
And then Mary's wondering, Steve, are all these 12 species found throughout Vermont, or are there certain areas where we may or may not see some of them?
Yeah. Yep. Nope. That's a great question. These are all birds you could find really anywhere in Vermont, in the forested areas anyway of Vermont. So they're not restricted to like high elevation or, you know, found in the Northeast Kingdom and not elsewhere. You can find them pretty much throughout the state.
Great. So let's see, here's a question from Anonymous, but let's see. So there has been more and more talk about the importance of mature undisturbed forest and carbon sequestration, hopefully to the point of the forest achieving true old growth status. Is there any evidence or folklore about birds we may have lost when the old growth forest disappeared? Are there any birds that we don't see in Vermont who need old growth conditions that may appear for the next generation if more of our forests are allowed to age as nature intended?
Yeah, it's a lot of great questions. So we're not really aware today, you know, any of the bird species we have today that would be what we call old growth obligates, meaning that they are only found in forests that are 100, 150 plus year old condition. What we do know is that, you know, those old growth forests do tend to be very structurally and compositionally diverse, which means there's a lot of different tree species found there. There's lots of different layers of vegetation, that understory and midstory, the canopy. There's big canopy gaps when a big tree falls down. There's lots of big logs on the ground. Like that is all part of the structure. And that is all important. All of those features are important to a lot of these birds. But it doesn't necessarily have to be associated with an old forest. It just has to be that structural condition existing in the forest. So part of, how do we achieve that? We can wait. We can look to those places that are kind of managed by nature and not by humans. And in time, those conditions can be achieved. Or we can achieve them as well through active management, so that we can achieve some of our other objectives that we have for our forest land. But I'm not aware, never heard of any species that are true old growth obligates, meaning again that they require a forest of a certain age in order to be found.
Great, thanks. That the example out west would be what, the spotted owl, that would be.
Right, and I don't know of anything similar to that
in the east,
in the Northeast.
Yeah, great. Okay, so I think, Steve, we've probably got time for one more question, and let's see. So we'll end it with Kathleen, who's just wondering sort of how she can help enhance wildlife, and that's, is it better for wildlife to pile fallen trees and branches into a wood pile, or is it better to leave them where they've fallen?
We try to emulate the way nature does things, those natural events. So when I kind of think of it this way, if a windstorm comes through the forest and topples some trees, do all of the tops of those trees scurry together to make one huge pile? Or do they kind of just stay scattered and left high? They don't get lopped down to 4 feet tall or anything like that. And so we try to emulate that the best we can. So my feeling is that if we're intentionally dropping some trees and to leave them on site for a habitat purpose, or even the carbon storage potential that tree is falling on the ground, just leave it as it is. Now you may have places where you do have some tops that of trees that you've cut off and you've removed the stem for a forest product, but you don't really get a good pile of that of those tops that can provide good cover. So it is okay to move some of that around to create these piles of, we call them piles of fine woody material to provide that cover. But I would say generally it's not a necessity to do that, because nature doesn't do that when it kind of manages itself.
Awesome, thanks, Steve. We've got a couple different people wanting to know favorite birds. So there you go. If you have to narrow it down to one.
From the birders dozen.
Yeah.
So it's one I didn't even mention before as a favorite bird. I will pick the black-throated blue warbler. And I'll tell you, the reasoning is that birds tell us about the forest. They tell us about the condition of the forest. And to me, one of the parts of the forest that we often lack is a really nice developed understory layer of young trees coming in underneath the overstory. But if we have black-throated blues, they're telling us that we have that structure, and that's a good thing. So particularly in our sugar bushes, when I hear black-throated blue warblers, I'm a happy person. So today my pick is black-throated blue warbler.
Awesome, cool. I think today my pick is scarlet tanager. That one, and for me, the mnemonic, or at least the image I get when I hear it singing, is like it's kind of like almost like a monkey sort of swinging through the woods, like a so I love that image, and I love knowing it's there. We also have oaks in our woods, so it's fun to have that association. Well, with that, Steve, this has been awesome hanging with you. I always learn like many new things every time I hear you talk about birds. So we really appreciate you being here tonight, and we appreciate everyone here for all your questions and enthusiasm. And as Jack had shared, we're going to follow up with an email with some resources, a list of places Steve and I can suggest for you to go visit to see some of these habitat conditions that have been managed for birds, and then the recording that we'll be posting to YouTube.
Awesome. Great. Well, thanks for inviting me to be part of this. It's been a lot of fun, as always. And thank you all for being with us.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
All right. Good night.
Have a good night.